This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 173 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. There's been a lot of talk over the last week about zero RB and the viability of the strategy through the first 4 weeks of the fantasy football season. A lot of people swear by it because we're seeing guys like Leonard Fournette and Dalvin Cook and Devontae Freeman all not playing because of injury. And when that's the case, it helps zero RB drafters. I'm not necessarily someone who goes zero RB. When I do, it's most definitely in full PPR leagues where I'm starting 3 wideouts and a flex. But all the research that I've done has suggested that having an elite running back gives you the largest edge in fantasy football. And while it's not always easy to have that running back on your roster, generally speaking, those backs are still coming from the early rounds of drafts. My go-to look this year actually was more of a modified zero RB approach. I'd actually argue that that's my most frequent strategy in fantasy football. I'll get an early round running back, and then I'll pound the receiver position and play that RB2 spot in a zero RB type of way. But regarding this season, I'm not sure I understand the victory laps. I mean, to be fair, I don't really understand victory laps after week 4 to begin with, but I don't know if we can look at the landscape today and confidently say that zero RB has been the ultimate strategy. And I'm trying to look at this objectively. It's not like I have some agenda against zero RB. There were multiple late round podcasts this offseason about how the NFL is bound to see a bounce back in passing this year. Fantasy football is a game about finding edges. The margin for error is so small each week, so you need every edge that you can get. I got the question from @smark_power this week that asked, given the offensive explosion so far, does it make elite wide receivers or running backs more or less valuable? And that's what's really key here. It's true that there have been running back injuries that have helped zero RB drafters. And there's also been a running back holdout that's helped them as well. But where is the edge coming at wide receiver right now? The scoring at the wide receiver position has actually been kind of flat. That's when you include top wideout Michael Thomas, who's been dominating through the first quarter. He scored a little over 100 fantasy points, which is 32 points more than 20th place Kenny Golladay. But after Michael Thomas and Adam Thielen, who have posted 199 points respectively, you've got a pretty big dip to Mike Evans at 88 points. The difference between Mike Evans and Babytron is 20 fantasy points. And it's not like every wide receiver who's performing well was drafted early. Thomas was a second rounder, Thielen was a 2-3 turn guy, and Evans was kind of in the same boat. And then there's Golden Tate, who's ranked 4th right now, and he wasn't a top 2 round guy. Hopkins is the 5th ranked wideout, and obviously he was a first rounder, but let's not sit here and pretend that Antonio Brown and Odell Beckham are crushing their ADP. That Keenan Allen is some slam dunk pick. And then you look at the top running backs right now in fantasy football: Alvin Kamara, Todd Gurley, Melvin Gordon, Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, Christian McCaffrey. All of those dudes were selected early in drafts. And those guys are absolutely giving you a larger edge at their position than almost any wide receiver at theirs. Now, I'm not bringing this up because I'm trying to pick a fight. I think there are going to be plenty of zero RB teams that crush it this year, just like I think there will be plenty of non-zero RB teams that do that too. My main point is that injuries don't automatically mean a position sucks. Plenty of early round running backs are dominating fantasy football right now. And there are lots of wide receivers coming from the 3rd, 4th, or even later rounds who are providing nice weekly output as well. I just don't think it's very clear cut at all right now. And I think there's a lot more football to be played before we see it being clear cut. And to that question of whether the offensive explosion makes elite wide receivers or running backs more valuable, I think the answer is running backs. If you have an elite running back, you've got a larger edge. This is something that I talked about on the podcast this offseason. If teams are spreading the ball out more and more, and teams are throwing it more and more, then that levels out the playing field a bit more at wide receiver. If teams are refusing to have workhorse running backs, then that makes the workhorse running backs more valuable in fantasy football. If there's less of something that you need, then that asset becomes more valuable. And entering the season, we thought there were going to be more workhorse running backs, but there hasn't been. There are a select few, and those select few are giving you a tremendous edge in fantasy football. And it just goes back to actually obtaining that asset. It's not an easy task, but to get elite running backs, you almost always have to spend. You almost always have to get them in the early rounds. And this year so far, in particular, you absolutely had to spend to get one of those difference makers at the position. But that's my take on zero RB and the value of running backs. It's too early to victory lap, and I don't really understand any victory lapping because running backs are actually pretty good this year. Before we get going with today's mailbag questions, I wanted to let you guys know about an exclusive FanDuel free play offer from Numberfire. If you head on over to fanduel.com/league/numberfire, you can join the free roll where prizes include FanDuel points and Numberfire premium subscriptions. And again, it's all free. Just go to fanduel.com/league/numberfire to join. This first question's from @Dylan McCannon. Buy, sell, or hold Dalvin Cook? I think the answer is to hold because selling him won't get you a whole lot, and buying a player who's been injured is always a big risk. The good news for Dalvin Cook is that he's been pretty involved in the passing game. The bad news is that Minnesota cannot run the football. Their running backs ranked dead last in success rate to start the season. So I would just hold tight if I had Cook, but I have a hard time buying a player who's been banged up. It's just the way that I play fantasy football. This next question's from @DogsOnTop. Expectations for the Packers backfield split going forward. This is an Aaron Jones truther podcast, so my hope is that Jones sees the most work in that backfield as the season goes on. And the good news is that when he returned 2 weeks ago from his suspension, he played about 25% of Green Bay snaps, and that increased to about a 38% share this last week. Jones was actually on the field more than any other Packers running back last week. According to Numberfire's expected points model, Aaron Jones currently has a near 65% success rate on the ground. That's absolutely bonkers. Jamal Williams' rate is 38%, and Ty Montgomery's is 56%. Unfortunately, this is all going to come down to a coaching decision, but things are most definitely trending up for Aaron Jones, and I'd be looking to buy him where I could. He's a really good running back. The next one's from @HolyPlankton. What do you think about Russell Wilson? Will his numbers come up like they have in the past, or has Schottenheimer killed his value? So the big thing with Russell Wilson is something that I mentioned on this week's Matchups podcast, and it's his rushing. His lack of rushing has totally killed his fantasy value. Last season, Wilson averaged 37 rushing yards per game, and he ran the ball almost 6 times per contest. This year, he's averaging 10.5 yards per game, and he's running the football fewer than 3 times per game. So not only has his volume been cut in half, but he's been less effective too. So I'm not really buying Russell Wilson from here on out until we see that change, until we see him utilize his legs a little bit more. This next question's from @Quentin_Bab. How do you analyze a true wide receiver breakout versus what is a 1-week wonder? For example, is Taywan Taylor legit, or is Geronimo just a 2-week phase? So there's not going to be one single clear-cut way to figuring this out, but there are pieces that you can put together to try to uncover whether someone's a 1-week wonder. The first is to just look at why it happened. Did the player force himself onto the field because he was good? Was there an injury? Was it the product of a good matchup? Those are all very important questions to ask. And then see how that wide receiver did it. Did he demand a huge target share, or did he just catch 2 bombs making him fantasy relevant? And then you could look at that player's history too. Was he a good prospect? Does he have tools to be a good wideout? And then there's also situation. Situation matters a whole lot too. Breakout wide receivers are more likely to be in good offenses than bad ones. But this is why I'm pretty high on Kiki Cutie. My prospect model liked him, he's in a pretty good offense, and while he might be 3rd in the pecking order, he saw a really strong target share in his debut this past weekend. And he should see the field quite a bit. So Cutie, to me, is here to stay. But that's generally the process that you want to go through when understanding if someone is for real or not. This next question is from @DavidFlynn3. What's your opinion on Hyde versus Chubb? My opinion is that Nick Chubb is a really good running back who deserves more touches. But it's a typical scenario where it doesn't really matter because coaches can drive the value of a running back in fantasy football. Carlos Hyde is also due for some serious regression. Based on his yardage totals, he should have about 3 fewer touchdowns than he has right now. It's just that the Browns have been super run heavy close to the end zone, and he's seen 3 more goal line carries than any other running back in football. It's just not sustainable. And then when you combine that with Nick Chubb being a great prospect, Hyde's outlook from here on out is a little bit scary. So I think he's absolutely a sell candidate, even with Baker Mayfield under center. And I really do hope that Nick Chubb starts to see a little bit more work. This next one's from @Anthony_B_FF. Should we be worried about Keenan Allen? Or did I just overestimate his ceiling in a standard league? Yeah, so full disclosure, I almost made Keenan Allen a buy this week in my 15 transactions column. I kind of wish that I did, to be honest. But the one thing that's holding Keenan Allen back right now isn't so much his target share, which is at 24.5%. It's his average depth of target. His ADOT last year was 9.3, and that really aided him in having the season that he had. This year, it's dropped to 7.9, but I don't think it's enough reason to panic. His usage is still pretty good. and touchdowns should absolutely come. This next question is from @FF_downunder. How far in advance do you look at strength of schedule given that we only have a 4-week sample size? i.e., the Cardinals have an excellent strength of schedule weeks 8 to 16 right now. How much do we value this? I mean, I think it depends on how you're looking at strength of schedule. If you're just looking at fantasy points against, then those numbers can be pretty skewed this early on. If you're doing it in a way where you're analyzing the schedule and digging deeper as to why it's a good one, then that, I think, is the way that you've got to do it. The thing is, though, there really aren't many defenses in the NFL right now that we should be really fearing. And that means the difference between one team's schedule to the next is not as significant. Unless the one team schedule is something like we're seeing with the Cincinnati Bengals, where it's bad defense after bad defense after bad defense for a large stretch of time. And before you Dolphins fans come at me, I'm really just referring to how they've got the Falcons, now the Dolphins, then the Steelers, Chiefs, Bucks, and Saints. It's amazing for passing purposes. So I'm looking at things a little subjectively when analyzing strength of schedule because our sample sizes are small right now. We can't just look at only fantasy points scored. I'm not saying that that's what you're doing, but I'm just making note of that. And I typically won't look so far in advance because a lot can change in the NFL. This next question is from @NJ Does Larry Fitz have a damn shred of hope? So multiple people have asked me this, so I figured I'd quickly answer it. I think he does have some hope, yes. He's got a new quarterback, and he had a tough matchup last week. If you have Larry Fitzgerald, you have to hold him right now. He may not be someone that you can start, but you should not be dropping him. This last question is from @AlexanderSuper0. Discuss the trade value of Patrick Mahomes. Look, every league is going to be different with how they value quarterbacks. I mentioned this before a couple of weeks back when talking about Pat Mahomes on a Mailbag episode. It actually might have been last week. Everything just kind of blurs together. But my general thought is that if you can get something decent in return for a quarterback in fantasy football, especially if you've got a lot of solid passers on your waiver wire, you do it. And in most fantasy football leagues, my guess is that you can get a pretty good return for Pat Mahomes right now. That's going to be it for today's show. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, SoundCloud, and Stitcher. And make sure you're following me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend.